Hi everyone, I'm Marcy, and if you've ever wanted to make homemade sourdough bread but didn't have any idea where to begin, you're in luck because my friend Brandi is here with a tutorial that we're calling Sourdough Bread for Beginners. Now, Brandi is also my hairdresser, but she has become quite the expert on sourdough bread.
Well, I don't know if I'd call myself an expert, Marcy, but I would say I have really grown to love to make sourdough bread, and my family really enjoys it too. I probably make about 6, sometimes 9 loaves a week. My family probably eats 5 to 6, but I share with neighbors, friends, clients, and it's a lot of fun and I would say super rewarding. To make the bread.
It. It's wonderful. I can't believe that many loaves. Well, she's going to be going over all the basics with us, and in the end, you'll be left with a beautiful, delicious artisan sourdough bread. It kind of looks like we have a science experiment going on here, but we're going to explain. The thing about sourdough bread is that it's unlike any other bread in that you don't need yeast for it. Its leavening agent is a sourdough starter.
That's right, Marcy. It is a sourdough starter. So actually, the starter is made of 2 ingredients, flour and water. And then, well, actually 3 ingredients, but the 3rd ingredient naturally happens. And that's the bacteria that's found on flour or your normal surfaces. And it's a good bacteria, not a bad bacteria. And so you mix the flour, the water together, and the good bacteria causes a wild yeast to happen and activates the starter. And so it actually is a natural yeast that happens from just 2 ingredients. So it's pretty cool.
And I was actually going to ask you about where you get the starter, but you alluded to the fact that it is flour and water. And I know that there are recipes for it online, but where else can you get a starter?
Yes, there are recipes online, but since everyone started making bread during COVID 3 years ago, there's always someone you can find online in your neighborhood app, in your church group, in your MOPS, whoever, and say, does anyone have starter? And 9 times out of 10, people are really willing to share their discard with you because, as you can see, you can make plenty. And if you don't find someone who has starter, you can always do things like go online, Google King Arthur, and order your own dehydrated starter. And then as you get that, I think it takes about 1 week to get it up and going at home, get it alive and ready to bake bread. So lots of options to make your own or get a starter and start it.
So once you have your starter, your job is to keep it alive, right?
That's right. So I actually brought my starter in 3 different stages so I can show you how we keep it alive, how we grow it, and what it looks like when it's ready to go. So this first starter here hasn't been fed for a couple weeks, and I did that purposely so I can show you guys. And so this kind of like grayish liquid on top is called the hooch. And if I take this off and we kind of smell it, it will almost have like a little bit of a alcohol smells kind of strong, and that will tell you your starter is starving and it needs to be fed. Still alive, still good to go, but needs to be fed. And so depending on your flavor palette, you could either pour some of this hooch out or all of it out before you feed it, or if you're like my husband who likes his sourdough bread very sour, I leave it in, mix it in there, add the flour and water, feed it, and get more of a sour tasting bread. So this starter I fed a few days ago when I made bread. I fed it a little extra just so I can show you guys what it's like to have a lot of discard. So after you feed your starter, it's active, ready to go, you make your bread, and then you put the rest in the fridge. Once it's been in the refrigerator, it's no longer active, and it's called discard. And so this discard is good to share with your neighbors who want to start making sourdough bread, or there's tons of recipes you can make. Like I make scones, crackers, pizza dough, biscuits. And then this starter I fed this morning. You can tell it's ready to go. It's full of carbon dioxide bubbles, so it's all bubbly. It's doubled in size, as you could see.
In fact, I was going to say, because you mentioned this to me earlier, your little trick where you use the rubber band.
Yes. After I feed my starter, I'll put the rubber band on the top of it to make sure I can tell when it's doubled in size, at its peak, and ready to go.
That is a great tip there. So now she's going to show us how to feed the starter, right?
Yes. So I actually am gonna feed this starter and give it to you so you have your own starter and you can make your own, start making your own bread on your sourdough journey. So what you always want to do is start off by putting your jar on your food scale, and you want to turn it on. And then once the jar is on, you want to make sure it's zeroed out and on grams. With sourdough bread, you always want to measure in grams. And grams don't convert over to cups or ounces, so you definitely need a food scale. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with this sourdough starter. So we just wanna remove this here. And then you see all that gray liquid in there, and that is called the hooch. And we're gonna pour some of this out before we feed the starter, just so it's not quite so tangy. And then I'm just gonna leave, you can just see there's just a tiny bit left, and that's all I really want left in here. And then I'm gonna take this and pour a little bit into this jar so we can measure. Kind of looks like pancake batter, if you see that. There's 427 grams here. So I'm gonna go ahead and clear this out to 0. And then I'm going to add 427 grams of filtered water. You always wanna make sure you're using filtered water because your tap water, most of the tap water, like ours here in Arizona, has a lot of chlorine, and that's gonna kill your good bacteria in here. So you always wanna make sure it's filtered, and you always wanna make sure you're using very clean utensils, because although this has bacteria, you don't wanna have bad bacteria get into your starter and cause mold or anything else that could make you sick. And so if you ever see any pink or red dots, strings, anything that looks like mold in your starter, then that tells you your starter has gone bad, and throw it away. Don't try to save it, okay? About 1 gram over, which is totally fine. Okay, then you just wanna mix the starter in with your water, using a clean utensil, of course. I'm gonna clear it to 0. Oops, maybe. Okay, so now we are zeroed back out, so our grams measured as 0. So now we're gonna add the flour in, and we wanna add 427 grams.
So this is equal parts starter, water, and flour.
Exactly, 1 to 1 to 1. And you don't have to use a knife to smooth out your flour because you're not measuring it with a cup, but by grams. We're at 284, so hopefully not too much more flour needed yet. We're just a tiny bit over, but that's okay. It's a couple grams over. It won't make a difference. So now what we're gonna do is stir this all together. So I'm just gonna take it off the food scale, stir it up. And then that is about good. And cover it up.
And then where do we store this?
You want to put it on your counter for about 6 to 8 hours, sometimes 12. If you live in a really cold environment, you'll want it on your counter longer. But here in Arizona, it's pretty warm, so probably 6 to 8 hours is good. And once this is doubled in size, you're ready to make your bread. And if for some reason you decide, I don't want to cook or bake today, you could just put it in your fridge tonight, and then you're good to go.
So now we're ready to make our dough, and we've got the starter that's ready to go and everything else pre-measured just to save some time.
Yes, so we have 500 grams of flour here, 10 grams of salt, and 390 grams of filtered water.
And then how much of this are you?
And then we're gonna use 100 grams of the fed and ready to go starter. So we're just gonna put this bowl on the food scale, and we're gonna turn it on. And again, just make sure it's on grams and zeroed out, and then we'll put 100 grams of this starter.
Okay, I guess I'll do this. I'm actually nervous.
No, this is perfect. You know what too, if you pour too much, you just take some out, so it's perfect. That's probably, yep.
Oh, you're good. You already knew. That's 118 grams.
So we'll just take a little bit out, and we're at 102, which is fine.
Okay, so what's next?
Now, if you want to add the water, and again, that's 390 grams of water we're adding in. And then if you want to add in the 10 grams of salt, trust me, you never want to forget the salt. I've done that, and I don't know why, but you have bland bread if you forget the salt. That little 10 grams makes all the difference.
Brings out all the flavor.
Yes. You want to stir this together, and then Just kind of lightly mix it all together. Then we'll add the flour in, and then we use our hand.
Do I need to worry about over mixing or anything like that?
It's almost, if you think about it, when you're mixing your yeast with your water or milk or butter, kind of the same thing, just a light mix. If you want to pour the flour in. So now, a lot of times I'll just grab my rubber spatula and kind of make sure everything's off the sides, and I'll just kind of do a little bit of a rough mix, and then I go in with my hands, which is messy. I'm just gonna take my hand and kind of slowly make sure it's all, whoops. Yeah, dirty work. Yes, just throw it back in there and just make sure there's no dry flour exposed. And you can see right now when I'm mixing it how it breaks apart and the dough's not really holding together. And so the thing with sourdough, you don't really knead it, you just mix it. The next step is we're gonna take a warm wet washcloth, or tea towel rather, we're gonna cover this up, and then we're gonna set a timer for 2 hours, and every half an hour for the next 2 hours, you come in and you stretch and fold your dough, and that helps cause it to have elasticity where it's not gonna break. It pulls together and it forms your really pretty dough.
So right now this is just a really wet, shaggy dough.
Exactly.
But it will lose some of that,
yes,
and
it
gain
comes
more
together.
elasticity.
But the one thing I do notice with sourdough bread, the more wet the dough, the less I work with it, the better it becomes. Like I like that really airy bread where there's a lot of nice holes in it and yummy.
So that's why we wet the tea towel.
Yes.
Every half hour for 2 hours, you stretch and fold the dough, taking one end and stretching it over and doing the same on all sides. There's no kneading, you just fold it completely over, cover and let it sit on your countertop until the next half hour. Then after the fourth and final fold, you let it rise untouched for 8 hours. So after 8 hours of rising, we're now ready to form our loaf.
I'm just gonna take the towel off here, and then we're gonna sprinkle some flour on the counter. Just a little bit on here, make a surface. So I'm just gonna plop this dough out of here onto the counter. I'm just gonna pinch each corner into the center. And I really don't like to overwork my dough. If I find that I overwork it, it's not as airy. And I really like my sourdough airy.
You can see the air pockets right there.
Yes, that is right. So then I just kind of do this, and then I'll gently flip it over once and just kind of form it. Again, I really like to work with a wet dough, and it just helps it become really airy. I'll sprinkle a little bit more flour on this towel. And then plop it on here. Fold it up. And then I'll put it back in my bowl, and it's ready to cool proof in the fridge.
And that way it keeps its form too, so.
Yes.
I'm gonna put this in the fridge and pull out one that's already ready for scoring.
Yes.
So this loaf has already been cold proofed, and Brandi was telling me that you need to do this for a minimum of 2 hours, but up to 36 hours, which is great because that gives you a lot of flexibility on when you want to actually bake it.
Yes.
And this looks beautiful already.
Now I usually just take a piece of parchment paper, set it out on the counter, and then I will take the loaf and just gently put it onto the parchment paper. And then I sprinkle a little bit of flour on top before I score it. And you wanna score it before putting it in the oven because your bread will crack, break open. But even sometimes scoring, the beauty of this bread is you'll still get cracks, but it looks rustic and beautiful anyway. And I usually do one knuckle, and then on this side, I just try to do a little design like this. And like I said, sometimes it comes out beautiful, sometimes it cracks.
That looks so beautiful already. Now we're going to drop it into our Dutch oven, and I forgot to mention that we've already got it preheating at 500 degrees, and we're gonna plop it in there while it's already hot.
So now we're gonna put the dough in the hot Dutch oven. So just be careful that you don't burn yourself. then I always like to throw 1 ice cube in, and I just do that to help keep the moisture, and then also it helps keep the crust softer.
Bake at 500 degrees for 30 minutes, then lower the heat to 450 degrees, remove the lid from your Dutch oven, and bake uncovered an additional 20 to 25 minutes until golden brown. Once out of the oven, let your loaf cool on a trivet at least 2 hours before eating. Fortunately, we don't have to wait any longer to dig into this bread because Brandi was kind enough to bring loaves in various stages just to save us time. So go ahead and cut into this. And I know it's a little tricky because sourdough
the crust can be a little thick. So I usually just kind of lift it up and, maybe.
And my knives aren't very good either. Okay. Oh, wow. That looks fantastic. Look how airy that is. Look at these little holes that you see in there. To me, that's just the mark of a fantastic sourdough bread. Now let's get a piece for each of us. Ooh, that looks so good. Got some butter. Try this. Nice and soft. Shall we do cheers?
Yes. Cheers.
Cheers. Wow. That is so good. You know what I love about sourdough bread? And this one in particular, it is so soft in the middle, even though you still have that crunchy crust. And this one's really tangy. I love that.
You know, a trick to keep it soft too is to store your bread. If you don't eat it all in one day like my family does, you want to just keep it on your counter with a tea towel over it or store it in a brown paper sack, but never in a plastic bag or in your refrigerator. It really dries out. So you want to keep it moist, and the only thing that should be crunchy and hard is the crust, not the inside.
That's fantastic. You've given us so many great tips. I hope that you all enjoyed this at home and that you save this video, share it with people who you know may be intimidated to make sourdough, because you just really explained this in a way that I feel like I'm ready to try this. So thank you so much, Brandi, for sharing all this and for all the preparation that went into you bringing everything at the various stages. I really, really appreciate it. And I love this bread. So thank you for everything.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. There's written information on sourdough bread in the description box below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. And please subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any of my recipes. I also invite you to follow me at Marcy Inspired on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, blessings from my kitchen to yours.